Hey folks, this is Kelani. As more and more people pick up classic World of Warcraft and start their new adventure in an old world, I can't help but wonder just how far along some people are. World First level 60 has already been achieved, and some shocking progress has been made in some of the first raids available for classic World of Warcraft, but I have a feeling that the majority of us aren't really anywhere close to that. I think Wowhead puts the average player at around the level 20 to 30 mark, which sounds about right if you ask me. We talked about some great add-ons for leveling in the previous video, but as I've gotten a little bit higher myself and started to poke around more dungeons like Scarlet Monastery and Razorfen Crawl, I couldn't help but think, well, what about dungeons? Sure, the leveling is significantly different and probably quite jarring for a lot of players, but so are the dungeons. You have to run to every dungeon, you have to set up all of the groups by yourself, there's no dungeon maps, and the bosses and loot work very differently too. So I decided to put together another little list of add-ons which are fantastic for improving the dungeon experience in classic World of Warcraft. Let's jump right in. This first add-on is probably already in your list if you've been playing for quite a while, because it is such a staple, and for a good reason. Classic World of Warcraft doesn't have the dungeon journal that we're all used to by now, so how can you tell what bosses drop what loot and how many bosses are actually in a dungeon? It's called Atlas Loot, ladies and gentlemen, and there's now a classic version for the add-on too. Atlas Loot Classic can show you all of the available loot of all the available bosses and rare monsters in any given dungeon or raid. If you really want to find a cool dagger or a new wand or maybe that elusive head slot item, flip through some of the dungeons which match your current level and browse to your heart's content. You can see the level ranges of each dungeon very clearly, so if you're level 32 and you see a dungeon which has a range of 32 to 42, that dungeon is probably a bit too difficult for you right now. You can get in that dungeon, but you're going to have a hard time actually getting through it if your entire group is made up of level 32s. So you want to hit the midline mark for the most part, with a few exceptions of course. If you're following dungeons as a group of 4 mages, which seems to be the super meta right now, you're going to be looking for different things, but I don't think the average player would be setting themselves up for a spell cleaving dungeon farm anyway. So Atlas Loot also doubles as a great add-on to see what dungeons are available to you at your current level. Sometimes you aren't really directed towards some of the dungeons, and a handful of them are entirely out of the way. If you're Alliance, you won't be sent over to the Wailing Caverns or Shadowfang Keep, and it's one heck of a trek to Scarlet Monastery. There isn't really any other way to get there though, and it's one of the best areas for dungeons because you have 4 dungeons all nestled together nice and neat, and they span quite a large level range. So it should come as no surprise that a lot of players are actually using the Scarlet Monastery to level up from the low 30s up to the 40 and then maybe a bit higher. So if you're looking for a new adventure, Atlas Loot can show you what dungeons you're able to find a group for, but that's not its main function. If you pick any dungeon, you can see the bosses and any rare monsters that can spawn in said dungeon. Rares work very differently in Classic too, by the way. They're actually rare with some unique loot. If you catch a rare monster in a dungeon, you should consider yourself very lucky. Each boss should drop a few pieces of loot which will increase as the level of the dungeon increases. Most dungeons later on have a lot more loot when compared to the earlier dungeons, so if you're a little bummed out that you only have 2 or 3 pieces of loot to choose from, that's going to change a bit when you get higher. Another really cool thing that Atlas Loot can do is show you all of the loot and items relating to various collections. That includes crafting and professions, all the potions, all the gear, all the enchants, everything you can get your hands on and where it comes from. That might be a bit much for some people, but the main thing is the gear collections. You can check out what the full dungeon sets or even the full raid sets look like right now, so you can see what your class might look like at level 60. It's always a good motivator when you can look at your character in the future and think, yeah, that looks awesome. I want to look like that. Another super useful feature is the phase marker. This is very specific to Classic because this didn't really happen in Vanilla. We had patches in Vanilla, but we have phases in Classic. If you open the Dungeons and Raids menu, you can see that most of the raids and the Dire Maul dungeons are marked with P2 through 5. Those Ps are related to the phase that the content will become available. We're currently in Phase 1. Phase 2 will include the Dire Maul dungeons, as you can see, and will kind of act like the first patch where more content is unlocked and more gear becomes available, and the phases will progress over time and unlock more and more of the raid content. So you can see exactly what content we have right now and in what order everything will unlock in, just in case that's something you're curious about. Now, another invaluable tool when you're playing in a group, and especially in dungeons, is a threat meter. Back in the day, everyone used to use Omen, but I've struggled to find an updated version that works with Classic, but we do have the Classic threat meter. This does more or less the same thing. It will show you your current threat on your current target versus anyone else in the party. Threat is a huge factor in Classic because tanks aren't given automatic aggro on everything. In retail right now, if a tank sneezes in the direction of a mob, they'll usually be able to hold aggro against anything thrown at it. A few expansions ago, threat was turned into a non-issue for the most part, as long as the tank isn't entirely AFK. That's not the case in Classic. You have to work pretty hard as a tank to get and hold aggro on monsters, especially groups of monsters. If your rogue is attacking one monster, the mage is attacking another, and your healer is throwing a few one casts into a third, you're probably going to lose aggro on at least one of those mobs, maybe two, maybe even all of them. That's where focusing down targets and threat comes in. You should always be hitting the tank's target unless you have a plan to do something else, and with a threat meter you can see how close you are to ripping threat off the tank. If your threat goes above the tank, you better be ready to take a hit or two. It's not too bad in dungeons at the lower levels, providing you have a healer who is paying attention. Most people, even the cloth DPS, can take a hit or two. If you get a good heal, you shouldn't die, but later on, pulling threat can get you killed very quickly, which obviously isn't ideal, so pick up a threat meter and keep yourself below the tank. If that means you just do some auto attacks for a few seconds to let the tank get a bit ahead of you, then that's what you do. There is a bit of a drawback with this specific add-on right now. It seems like you can only see the threat of other players who are actually using the add-on. So if your group doesn't have the add-on at all, especially your tank, it kind of becomes useless. The good news is that almost everyone should be using this add-on by the time you hit max level and start raiding, because threat really is a big deal, so that shouldn't be a huge factor in the long run. If you'd rather pick up something that works even if your allies don't have the add-on, I would recommend picking up something like threat plates. Honestly, any nameplate add-on that has built-in threat will work well. But threat plates is my favourite right now. Depending on whether you have it set up for tanking or DPSing, the nameplates of any given monsters will change colour to signify if you have threat or if you don't have threat. As a DPS or healer, green nameplates mean you don't have threat because that's what you want to happen. If you start pulling threat, they'll turn yellow, and if you have threat, they'll glow an angry red. As a tank, it should be the opposite. Red if you don't have aggro, yellow if you're gaining aggro, and then green if you do have aggro. At least that's how it's supposed to work. Some classic add-ons have been struggling a little bit here and there, but that doesn't really surprise me. Classic has only been out for a week properly at this point, so there should be some growing pains, especially with add-ons and API changes. Threat plates will also let you see a bunch of other bits and bobs like cast bars and timers, as well as damage over time effects and durations on the nameplate of monsters. If you don't like the classic look all too much, threat plates is a fantastic alternative that can help you with managing threat. Another type of tracker that you're going to want to get your hands on is a damage meter. We all know that's the most important part of any dungeon, right? Who's on top of the damage? Well, that's what you're going to want to pick up Detail's Damage Meter Classic WoW for. Yes, you can use Recount if you really want to, but anyone who wants to be in the cool kids club will download Details. It's faster, it's more accurate, and in my opinion, it just looks better. You can set up any number of windows to track a whole variety of things: deaths, dispels, damage taken, you name it. Personally, I keep it simple with just a damage meter and a healing meter. That covers the bases, and I'm pretty happy with it. It's not just a tool to flex with though. Being able to accurately track your damage and compare it to other players is incredibly valuable. You can see how much of your damage comes from certain abilities, which can help you decide whether something is actually worth casting. If a Shadow Bolt does more DPS than your damage over time effects entirely, do you really need to apply all of those damage over time effects, or is it kind of a waste of mana? If your wand does more passive DPS than your main spell, well, I mean, do you really need to cast Smite over and over again? Probably not. Breaking things down so you can read them very easily can help you get more out of your character, and if you're lower on the damage meters when compared to someone else, you can maybe get a hint or two from their damage breakdown about what they're doing differently, so you can change things up and test out some different ways of playing. The way in which Classic is set up is pretty awesome too. Both tanks and healers get a chance to actually deal some damage. It's always fun spiking to the top of the DPS meters as a healer, even if it does burn through all of my mana. If you want a damage meter in your dungeons, look no further than Details. And then we have the boss timers. These are going to be more useful the later in the game you get, because a lot of the earlier bosses don't actually have that many abilities, if any, but it's always handy having a timer and a bar for any ability that you have to watch out for. It's going to be super important when it comes to raiding, and for dungeons it's going to be nice to have, but maybe not super required. The two major ones, DBM and Littlewigs, do have classic versions, but they're both works in progress. Hopefully they'll be much more reliable when the majority of us get to the raiding portion of endgame. Now there are some other amazing add-ons you should absolutely pick up, but I already covered them in the other video. I'll link that below if you want a bit more information about them, but I would strongly suggest you pick up Vendor Price. That one will show you how much an item vendors for without having to take it to a vendor to check. Classic Aura Durations is super important for anyone who uses a lot of damage over time effects. It will try to give an accurate time remaining on any debuffs you apply to enemies, or even buffs you apply to allies. I would also recommend picking up any add-on that provides you with a cast bar of your enemies, kind of like what threat plates will do if you use that add-on. If you don't want a nameplate add-on, at least pick up classic cast bars. That does the same kind of thing, but it won't affect any of your nameplate settings. And finally, before we head off, you might be wondering why a Looking for Group add-on isn't included in this video at all. If you weren't aware, and you might not be, considering the main Looking for Group add-on that was being developed for Classic still has a lot of downloads on Twitch, Blizzard decided that a lot of these add-ons weren't keeping with the spirit of Classic or Vanilla, so they took action to render them useless. For the most part, a Looking for Group add-on won't function in Classic WoW because of the changes that Blizzard has made to the API. Personally, I think that's a good thing. Bringing the LFG tool into Classic could have been done fairly easily by Blizzard themselves if they thought it was something the game would stand to benefit from, but they don't think it would be a good fit, and I have to agree with them. If that means I have to spam general chat, trade chat, maybe a few yells here and there while my friend spams general chat of the dungeon zone, so be it. That's how it was back in the day, and that's honestly how I would prefer to find my groups in Classic WoW. It's worked out pretty well so far. I kind of expect something to pop up later on down the line that will make it easier to create groups, but for now you stuck to the good old-fashioned way. And that's my list of must-have add-ons specifically tailored for dungeons in Classic World of Warcraft. Is there anything on this list that you're already using? Is there anything missing from this list that you think deserves to be mentioned? Leave all your thoughts in the comments section below. A big thank you to all of our supporters over on Patreon. You can see the names floating by on screen. If you want to join these lovely guys and gals, you can find a link in the description below. Remember to leave a like just below the video before you leave. If you want to see more, make sure to subscribe. But apart from that, thanks for watching folks, good luck and have fun, and as always I will see you next time.